Perspective is tricky. It's one of the things that lots of artists struggle with. It's one of the things where most people know the rules, but despite knowing those rules, we still have trouble implementing them. And not only that, but the rules are quite simple. And, the rules are simple, but the application is complicated. So also I think for artists, we're often less kind of technologically, mathematically minded. And the process of creating art is kind of more intuitive than perspective sort of feels. So there's lots of issues when it comes to dealing with perspective as an artist. To begin with, let's think about sort of what perspective is and where it came from. If we think about sort of some of the earliest art, cave paintings, there really wasn't a lot of perspective. You can see some here and some sort of concept of depth, and it's not really just being flat. There's a lot more sophistication going on here, especially when you consider the materials used. But in general, we're not really thinking about perspective. And there was a concept of perspective sort of going back to, sort of 400 BC, somewhere around there, where people used it for, sort of tricks, illusions, and that sort of thing. Like, it was understood kind of that these things happen in our brain and you can kind of trick the brain and like something's going on. But still, people did art for a long time really without a solid understanding of perspective. And, you can see here's some sort of paintings from like 1200 AD, and people are kind of trying to get it, and there's kind of an understanding, there's an intuitive understanding, like, oh, things kind of get smaller as they go back, and you can kind of see it, but, everything here is sort of, you can kind of tell that the perspective doesn't really match. But people are trying, and obviously, some of these things are in perspective, but not everything is kind of connecting up. And, I think this is sort of this one might be from sort of 1400s, and probably by that time, or maybe 1600 or something like that. By that time, you can see it's sort of starting to get somewhere, but still, but by this time around sort of 1400, AD, people were kind of starting to get it, and there were books written. You had a lot of sort of Renaissance painters and people understanding the mathematics of it, geometry. That was quite big in those times. So people sort of started to get the hang of it, like 500 years ago. But you can see here, even still, this is kind of, some of it is not really working. There's sort of some of it is kind of understood, but really this is kind of bad perspective. And you can see this is interesting because this painting probably would have taken a long time to create. Many kind of weeks and months probably, but still there wasn't an understanding of perspective. And despite a lot of work being put in, it's still not correct. But people got a lot better at perspective, and if we look at sort of someone like M.C. Escher, obviously as time progressed, people really got to understand how to create images in perspective, and sort of also how to trick your eye, and just the interesting things that can happen when we kind of apply perspective and can gain control of it through art. And obviously as we progress. Throughout the history of art, people and artists started to get, really solid control of perspective and depth, also using all sorts of other atmospheric perspective cues. But really, for the moment, we're just talking about sort of geometric perspective and just kind of how to construct forms. But yeah, as I said, as we progress, people kind of start to understand how to put these things together, and mostly the way that people got here and sort of separated this sort of art from this sort of art is just through understanding this sort of concept of geometric perspective. The things that you've probably heard about, like vanishing points, horizon line, all that kind of stuff. But it's important to note that this stuff, this concept of like perspective as vanishing points and things getting smaller and all that kind of stuff, drawing lines, drawing boxes in perspective, all this measurement. This is not all there is to perspective. It's just one aspect. So although we're going to focus on this, I just want to quickly run through some of the other aspects of perspective which are just as important. One of them is that we can show perspective through overlap. Just objects are in front of others shows depth, which shows perspective. We can show depth even if we're not measuring accurately, just by making things smaller as they get further away. Obviously, this is something which is comes from people sort of understanding that, you know, there's lines here and a lot of math and geometry going on, but the simple principles are that just things get smaller as they go into the distance. The same object is going to get smaller as it goes further away. The other thing is atmospheric perspective. So objects move tonally towards the neutral as they recede, except really light colors. That's kind of one of the kind of exceptions to this rule. But yeah, in general, there's a lot of atmosphere around, and light finds it hard to kind of bounce off objects that are really far away and then get to your eye. So it's kind of, you know, things become harder to see, detail is lost. There's more atmosphere, more particles in the air between your eye and really far off objects. So depth, which is often what we're trying to achieve through perspective and through geometric perspective, can often be acquired and created through just combining these simple objects. And it's important to understand that, you know, you don't always need to have every single aspect of perspective in an image. You know, using sort of depth or sort of geometric perspective, or just kind of making things smaller, you know, more like guesstimating. Just one of these will give you sort of, you know, a good feeling of depth. But often you have this issue of kind of like, why does it look wrong, you know? And if we go back to sort of these, you know, we've got these sort of things where it's like, obviously someone's put a lot of effort into this image, as I said, but it's still wrong. And the reason that these are wrong, they're wrong because we've got certain rules being applied with perspective, like we've got vanishing points sort of being applied here, and these lines which are parallel are sort of converging to a vanishing point, but we've got other elements in the scene which are converging to other vanishing points. And the same here, we can see the tops of some of these things, but this sort of tower over here, we can't see the top of that somehow because he wasn't quite sure sort of how that converges back. Same with these things. It's kind of, some of it's flat, some of it's graphic. So one of the things that really is often at the root of something looking wrong, and it's sort of feeling like perspective is off, is that we've used a rule, and it can be any of these rules, either the geometric perspective, sort of depth, atmosphere, etc. But we've used one of these rules in one part of the image to help our image, but in another part of the image, we're violating that same rule. So that would be, i.e., if we go back to this previous example, we've kind of got some vanishing points here, which is showing that there would be a horizon line somewhere around there. But over here, we've got these things vanishing to different lines. So we've got multiple vanishing points and multiple horizon lines and multiple all this kind of stuff. And what that means is we've used this rule of parallel lines converging to a single point on the horizon, and we've violated it in another place because we've got another set of parallel lines, you know, for that probably shouldn't be, if you look at the scene, converging to a different horizon. Same here, we've got some elements which are kind of converging, but we've got other graphic shapes here which haven't been properly applied to the same logic, the same geometry. So that's the number one rule, is that you need to keep things consistent. If you're using a particular perspective rule, like you're making sure everything's geometrically accurate, or you're making sure you've got some atmospheric perspective, you need to make sure that the whole scene applies those rules. So, you know, anything that's kind of around the distance there needs to kind of have the atmosphere applied to it. If you don't, it'll look weird. And that's sort of the same thing here. Like this guy is the same kind of shade as this, so we assume he's kind of on the same plane. You know, he's not like a really giant character in the background. So those are the basics, but there are sort of standard perspective rules that cover the geometric perspective, which is, you know, probably the most important thing to get your head around, just because it gives you a lot of confidence as an artist. So this concept of geometric perspective, i.e. we've got a horizon line, we've got vanishing points, and we're using 1 or 2 or 3 point perspective, or more complicated perspective setups like curvilinear perspective, whatever. This is basically how we relate things in space and how we kind of get things to feel like all of these boxes, all of these buildings are kind of sitting on the same, sitting in the same place, the same space. So, you know, we can see these things are supposed to kind of be next to each other, and they feel next to each other because we're locating all these points in space. And that's kind of what we're after, is basically using geometry and applying this kind of concept of perspective to kind of find objects in space and make sure they're all kind of feeling like they're in the same space. So you might ask, and certainly I ask because I'm interested in these kind of questions, is why do these rules work? So the concept of there being a horizon line and vanishing points, basically parallel lines converge into the distance until they vanish. Basically, they converge infinitely until they get to one point. This just kind of happens. This is how we see things. And we've got a horizon line, and the horizon is basically where our eyes or head sits. This is kind of the level at which if you look out into the sea, this is the horizon as far as you can see. That's kind of where that level is. So often you have this thing of like 1 point, 2 point, etc. The reason that we can apply so much geometry to the world is because we have gravity, and gravity means that things are often built in relation to gravity, in relation to gravitational pull. So things are always flat, so we can walk on them, and you know, tables and desks and the things we interact with are flat, so that we can, you know, things don't roll off them. It sounds very simple, but you know, if a table is off by a couple of degrees, everything just, you know, you put your pen on it, rolls off. It's no good. You know, or if you've ever been to a cafe or something, and you know, one of the tables is a bit kind of wobbly, and you kind of lean on it, and it'll kind of, you know, tip, and then all your food goes off, or you know, like stuff gets spilt. So you know, even if things are off by a little bit, kind of gravity starts to mess with us. And the other thing is that things need to be built in opposition to gravity. So you often have beams which might support something kind of vertical. It's kind of perpendicular to the ground plane, so that they can support, you know, because basically if you, you know, just something that's vertical in opposition to gravity is going to be stronger than something that's kind of tilted. So because that our world is built this way, and generally when we're talking about geometric perspective, it's where we're trying to draw and create geometric objects that are man-made. Often those other concepts of depth, etc., are really going to be applied to, are much easier to kind of apply to naturalistic elements. But when we're talking about man-made things, that's when we want to use this perspective, you know, when we're drawing buildings or whatever. And the reason that they apply is not for any kind of mystical reason. It's just that we have this thing called gravity. And that means that when we look at the world, if we sort of, you know, consider kind of what's happening here, we're sort of sitting there on the ground, and we're kind of viewing the world, and the horizon line is kind of on the same level as our eye. And so, you know, when you've kind of got a building or something over here, basically what's happening is that we're kind of looking out at the world, and this is how we experience the world. And with art, we basically want to represent our view of the world and put it onto paper, so that when someone else sees it, they go, yep, okay, that is how I also view the world, and that makes sense, as opposed to again, if you kind of look at some of these things where we look at it and we go like, that doesn't look like what I see. I can understand it. I can understand what's going on, but it doesn't feel realistic, because when I look at something like this, I would see something different, because, I'd be sitting at a certain place and there'd be a horizon line and all these lines vanish to a certain point. That's why these rules are important. And basically there's a lot of rules and a lot of ways we can simplify what's a very complex world, and kind of make just a few lines kind of really apply and do a lot of work. So these are the basic rules. We've got a horizon line. The horizon line is probably the most important part of perspective. And that's basically just defines where we are, because perspective is really just relating where geometric objects are in relation to a viewer. And, as you can see in those examples, that's kind of what's happening. When there's good perspective, it feels like we're kind of in the scene, and, things are kind of sitting right. It's not just random things kind of floating everywhere. So the horizon is important because it represents kind of where our head is at. It doesn't necessarily mean where we're looking, and we'll come to that later, but probably in other demos, but this is just where our head is at, horizon line. And the other rule that's really important is parallel lines converge. So two, train tracks is the classic example. They just converge into the distance, basically into infinity until they join. And, this is the same for any parallel lines on a box or a rectangle, on the sides of a cylinder, any kind of lines that are parallel, which means next to each other, and they're kind of geometrically, the same distance apart. If you look at them in perspective, they'll basically converge into the distance. And this is really despite all sorts of complex lines and all sorts of stuff happening, this is really all we're doing, is just extrapolating on these rules, and especially sort of these two, the horizon line and the parallel lines converging. The other really important sort of rule that's good to pay attention to is above the horizon, we see the bottom of objects, and below the horizon, we see the top of objects. This is just simply because the horizon line represents where our head is. When we look up, we see the bottom of an object. When we see down, we see the top of an object. So if we look at, again, look at some of these examples. This is a great one. So we can kind of find on this image sort of where the horizon line is, and it sort of seems like it's sort of somewhere kind of around here. Not entirely sure where, but yeah, somewhere kind of around there. Because down here we can kind of see the top of this balcony, but up here we can kind of see the bottom of it. That makes sense. So this is really important, and it's not necessarily, if you work everything out geometrically, obviously this will occur, but it is one of the most important rules to remember, is that just simply above the horizon, we see the bottom of things. If you look up, you see the bottom of something. If you look down, you see the top of something. If you're in a sort of classroom, a simple one is kind of, you can see the top of the desk. If you sort of get on the ground, you can see the bottom of it, but not the top, vice versa. It sounds like really simple, but if you just apply most of these rules, perspective will kind of happen. So the other thing that kind of trips people up is this concept of vanishing points. And vanishing points are sort of, it's a simplification of perspective. And it's basically, and we'll talk about this later, but these are basically sort of abstracting perspective, what is in reality lots of sort of crazy perspective lines going everywhere, potentially sort of curvilinear perspective where lines are kind of curved and you've got all sorts of different objects converging. Maybe, a house might be a little bit askew versus another house, and you might have this thing which is a little bit curved or something. So, but in general, we try and make everything sort of uniform to simplify it. And the concept of vanishing points is basically parallel lines are going to converge, and other lines which are parallel if you have a street. And really this works mostly because we have lots of geometric forms in our kind of man-made world where we've got things that kind of parallel to each other because we build with blocks, and we build things square because it's kind of easy. So yeah, you kind of can set a fairly limited number of vanishing points for objects, and you can build most things based on that. But where the vanishing points are on the page kind of defines the lens we see through. This is quite a tricky one, and we can really only get at it through experience, but it's just really important to remember that where you place the vanishing points defines kind of the lens that you're looking through. So if you understand what like a wide angle lens is, or a fisheye lens where you kind of see a really kind of round, really wide angle view, and all the sides of that lens are kind of curved, that's sort of because what's happening is you've got this kind of curvilinear perspective, and the vanishing points are kind of, you know, quite close together. If something's kind of, if you're like a lot further away from everything and everything's a lot sort of flatter, then you're going to have vanishing points are a bit further away. And, you know, again, this is quite subjective. There are mathematical ways to work this out, but this is a general rule to sort of think about and just understand what's happening when you place the vanishing points. This is not necessarily just random, because we're in control of this. So yeah, important to remember, reality has lots of perspective lines. It has lots of complexity. We're seeing the world through an eye which is spherical. And in essence, we're kind of, through using perspective and defining these rules, we're able to kind of simplify things and kind of create some images that are quite representative of what someone sees. But even so, you know, this image is really just sort of one point perspective. It's very similar. It's very simple, but it's doing a really good job at representing kind of, you know, like us sort of sitting here on a balcony or something and watching this procession and just the scope. The same sort of with these images. It's doing a good job at kind of representing what someone would see and making us kind of believe things. And, you know, even this one is kind of making us believe things which kind of can't happen. It's tricking our eye. Whereas these ones are kind of confusing our eye. We look at them and we're like, something's wrong. You know, whereas you kind of look at this one and nothing's really wrong because there's not that many rules broken. It just doesn't have that many sort of lines or anything going on because, you know, probably at this point, I don't know how long ago, but, you know, potentially sort of 10,000 BC or more. These kind of images, you know, they weren't straight edges, so people weren't like, oh, how do I draw buildings? There were no buildings at all. There were no hard surfaces. You know, there was no metal. You're talking about stone tools where, you know, people are chipping different rocks to create stone tools. That's the level of technology at this point. So, you know, this is really a problem of having solid objects to represent. And, you know, also a problem of having to represent it because, you know, painting didn't always exist. You know, it's kind of a technology that's improved, and the level of stuff that we've been able to do has certainly, you know, improved based on, you know, us having like paints and stuff like that. You know, whereas before, you know, you would often have things like tapestries and other ways of representing art, or sort of hieroglyphic constructs of art that are much more graphic. So yeah, the idea is basically we've got this really complex world of perspective, but we simplify it, and we simplify it so that it's easier to draw. It's that simple. Only use what you need to draw an image. If you can get away with 1 point, you know, and again you can see, you know, there's some great 1 point images around the place where the perspective, even though it's very complicated, there's lots of stuff. You know, like all of these things are kind of calculated. All these lines, all this stuff is geometrically worked out, you know, fastidiously. Still, it's just 1 point perspective. So yeah, keep in mind, you don't necessarily have to create sort of, you know, 3 point perspective to make something look real or feel grandiose. But yeah, we basically just simplify this concept of vanishing points everywhere, and potentially all these different things, and we kind of say, okay, there might be all these parallel lines are converging to different places, but let's just say because we're kind of not really close to some object, and because we're not trying to create some sort of 3-point perspective thing, we don't need it for our image. Let's just say that all of that parallel lines converge because these ones are converging, and these ones, let's just say that they're sort of straight, that they don't converge, and let's say that these ones don't converge either, and the ones that converge are just the ones that are kind of going to this point. So if we draw anything that's kind of has a line that's going this way, we're not going to converge it this way or do anything. We're just going to say this is straight. And that just simplifies it. So 2-point is similar to this, except we are saying we've got a vanishing point here, and these ones are parallel lines. These will all converge to this same vanishing point. And we've got another one here. So all of these lines that were here are now vanishing here. But all the lines that are kind of sort of horizontal, all the ones that are vertical, are going to be locked to the same sort of axis. They're not going to converge. And 3-point is where we say, okay, we've got 3 kind of levels, 3 kind of axes, and really you kind of only need 3 to represent something. You've kind of got sort of, one way this way, one way that way, and that really defines 3-dimensional space. So if we have 3, then we can sort of define something. And this way we're saying all of these lines which are parallel are converging to a vanishing point. These ones are no longer locked. We're just using more vanishing points, and we're going to try and create more complex perspective. But it's important to understand, and this is the most important thing to understand really, is just because they converge doesn't mean it will look good or right or natural. And really what we're after, rather than it looking sort of geometrically correct, is that the image looks right. So again, you can see those examples where it's 1 point, the image looks great. You can see the image of the bull, the cave painting, that looks great because it doesn't have any perspective. Just simple, it looks fine. We're not like, well, the perspective on that is off. It looks a bit weird. You can still draw everything geometrically so that things are converging and all this stuff is happening. You've got a horizon line. It still look awful because, or wrong, or just like not how you want, because the vanishing points themselves are placed poorly. So part of perspective is kind of conceiving a scene and trying to place vanishing points in a logical way that's going to support the mood that you want. So this might be the mood that you want, but it might not. And certainly this is the number one thing that people run into when they're doing perspective. To begin with, is they draw it all correctly, but the vanishing points are all on the page and it looks like this kind of big wide angle lens, and then they're like, well, I did it right, but it still doesn't look right. The second thing, or just another thing to consider is sort of rough it in. You don't need to have a full-on perspective grid and have a crazy number of lines everywhere. You can kind of estimate, and basically, if you've got 2 lines, sort of, I can sort of find, the halfway point between 2 sort of sections of that line. I can draw a line in the middle, and that's going to kind of give me an estimate. I don't need to necessarily trace everything back to the vanishing point. If I wanted to draw a window or something, I could kind of say, well, where's like kind of halfway between there? Let's sort of draw something like that. Again, I'm kind of guessing around here, and then we could maybe sort of try and draw a door or something on it. So it's you don't necessarily have to get this ruler and always sort of trace things back to a vanishing point, because really what we're doing here with perspective is that we have geometry and we're just kind of projecting it into perspective. So really what perspective is about is measuring. What this geometric perspective about is measuring where things are in space in relation to each other. So as long as you can measure it accurately based on something, then you're good. It doesn't always have to be tracing things back to the vanishing point. And often you'll see with very complex perspective, when you're doing curved surfaces, form drawing, lots of really complex stuff, you kind of can't find everything via vanishing point. Perspective is not just about vanishing point. It's about measuring geometric shapes in space, often in relation to each other, often in relation to a ground plane. Often the vanishing point is not the most important thing, the ground plane is. So yeah, the basic way to kind of avoid this sort of concept is have one vanishing point on the page and one off. That'll give you sort of a nice simple field of view that's going to feel a bit more natural than kind of this sort of thing where we've got one vanishing point. It's off the page, but probably not enough to create that sort of natural feel. Especially when you've got 3 points sort of going on. So one VP on, one off. Definitely if you've got 3 point perspective, kind of one VP on and 2 off. It's going to look more natural. That's often the look that you'll probably be after. So yeah, in the basic rule that's most important when it comes to overall perspective is that consistency is king. The most important aspect to focus on is just making sure that you sort of don't create more complexity than you need, and that if you use one of these rules of perspective in one area of your image, that you follow those rules again when you're creating other elements in your image. And that's basically it.